Hello, with me today is Michael Pregent, a former intelligence officer and a national security expert. Among his many areas of interest and expertise is the IRGC and Iran's proxies, and that's one of the main topics in the news today. So I'm just going to start right off. You know, Michael, when you look at the headlines and what the world is focusing on, obviously it's the US and Israel, Iran, a bit of sort of Gulf and so on. But what seems to be getting short shrift, but is obviously an important topic for our region, is Iran's proxies and the way it's managed to exert its influence and power well beyond its immediate neighbors. And I want to start off by asking you, what is going on with the proxies now that we're in this war with Iran? Because Houthis have been quiet, various things are going on with other proxies. Can you just fill us in on where you think things are now with the proxies?
Well, thanks for having me. When it comes to Iran's premier proxies, we've seen severe degradation of Hezbollah's capabilities. We've seen the degradation of Hamas and also the Houthis. And now the U.S. is starting to target the Hashd al-Shabi, the Popular Mobilization Forces, which are Iran-backed militias in Iraq. And this is something that I've worked on for a decade. These militias inside of Iraq that have somehow found their way into the government based on the U.S. requests are thinking if they come into the government, they will be able to be controlled. And the opposite has happened. They've come into the government and they are now in control of it. So that's the scenario inside of Iraq. When we look to Iran, pre-strike, pre-war, pre-Operation Epic Fury, even before the 12-day war that Trump likes to call the 12-day operation back in June, it was always the fear that Iran would use its proxies to target Israel, to overwhelm Israel's air defenses with rockets, missiles, and drones. And that has been degraded to the point where that is no longer a hammer for the regime. The regime now has to fight on its own. And it's very comfortable now, even though there have been costs in launching ballistic missiles, rockets, and drones. That's been degraded as well. But now we're seeing proxy escalation. It triggers along the Syrian-Iraqi border. What does Jalani or al-Shara do with his forces? How does he look at Iraq? Is it stable? Is it unstable? Are the militias vulnerable at this point? And I would argue that the Iraqi militias are the low-hanging fruit in this war. They're the easiest ones to target. They don't have air defense systems, and they have pretty much been left alone for the last decade, absent a couple reprisal strikes following an attack in Jordan, which killed 3 service members. The attack in January, actually December 29th, that killed an American translator and resulted in the death of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. So the proxies right now are being targeted. When we look at the Houthis in the Gulf of Aden, Bab el-Mandeb, right? We're looking at the Houthis and they're suppressed right now. They're not taking action, but they could. So we're looking at that as something that we need to keep an eye on, because that's another trigger. That's another place where Iran can use a proxy to escalate, to elevate threats in that area. So that's the current status right now of Iran's proxy forces.
And let's delve a little bit more deeply into Iraq. So, what do you think might happen next? Because the situation really is quite fluid, and kind of what are some ways that Iran might try to exploit its rather weak neighbor?
I think at this point, Iran is becoming the rather weak neighbor to Iraq. Iran is becoming that weak neighbor to Iraq, in that it's no longer able to credibly arm the militias, to credibly support and fund the militias. So the militias are almost acting in a panic mode. Our state sponsor of terror, Iran, is being hit, its leadership degraded, its capacity to arm, provide logistical support, provide direction is being degraded as well. So at this point, I see the Iraqi militias are being exposed. And what I mean by being exposed is their ties, their penetration, their primacy inside of Iraq's security apparatus. The Badr Corps, Iran's premier proxy at the beginning of the 2003 invasion of Iraq by U.S. forces, uh, you know, the Badr Corps has created 5 militias out of that organization, led by very capable Badr commanders. We've seen Kitab Hezbollah come out of the Badr Corps. We've seen Harakat Nujabah come out of the Badr Corps. And out of the Sadr initiative, Qasem Soleimani picked the talent. He picked Qais Khazali, he picked Akram al-Kabi, he picked, forget the other guy's name right now, but I'll think of it in 2 minutes. But created new militias. Those militias have primacy inside of the Iraqi security forces. The Badr Corps is the officer corps. And every Iraqi pilot that has been trained by Americans has been vetted by the Badr Corps, which means vetted for allegiance to the Islamic Republic of Iran. So this is all exposed now. Sudani out there saying that the Hashd al-Shaabi are authorized to use military force when they're attacked against the Americans, and now putting in a request to deny, a request through the UN to deny a U.S. access to its airspace. And my argument would be the militias inside of Iraq are targetable. They are hostile enemies. They are designated terrorist groups, and denying U.S. airspace to attack a terrorist organization just won't stand. So this is going to expose Baghdad, and I think the funding will be cut. I think U.S. disfavor towards Baghdad is coming, with a preference towards the Sunni areas in Iraq, North and West Iraq, and also the Kurds. We're seeing the return on investment for denying Iran's penetration, the Islamic Republic of Iran's penetration of Baghdad's security apparatus, intelligence apparatus, infrastructure. Every economic sector, just like Iran, has been penetrated by an IRGC Quds Force linked militia. And now that's exposed. And now the U.S. has tools to be able to disfavor Baghdad and finally address this problem that Iraq somehow is a stable ally in the region when in fact it's a satellite state of the regime.
So, going with that, what does the disfavoring look like, and where could that lead? What are the different sort of scenarios you see?
Well, economic sanctions, sanctioning Iraq's oil. I mean, look at the Strait of Hormuz right now. I mean, Iraq is hurting. They're not able to push things out. Iran is hurting. Of course, Asian markets and European markets that rely on that 20% coming out of that region. The world's oil reserves, or the oil basically coming out of the Strait of Hormuz. This is affecting Iraq in a significant way. The U.S. could basically say, we're going to recognize an autonomous region in northern Iraq with the Kurds, and we're going to allow them to start pumping that oil out without restriction and sending that to Europe, bypassing Baghdad, demanding that the Shia political parties tied to Tehran are disbanded or disqualified from running in elections. There are things we can do. Those are hard things to do. But the easy thing has led us to the situation where these militias have now shown their face. The ties to Baghdad are now, so transparent that there's no difference between them. And we need to hold Baghdad accountable.
Can you talk to us a bit about the Houthis and kind of what's going on with them? It seems to be quiet. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think if you look at your main, supplier of weapons, where you basically draw your, you get your orders from, you draw your inspiration from, you get your salaries from, you get everything that they depend on from Iran is kind of stopped. It's a stovepipe, and it's not open to them anymore. So the funds are running out, the weapons, the training, the advisors. And so when you look at your benefactor and your benefactor is under attack, what do? I think the Houthis right now feel very isolated. You've seen Hamas actually ask Iran to stop targeting Gulf neighbors, their primary benefactor being Qatar, of course, through Iran. Iran's money through Qatar to Hamas, and vice versa. The Houthis, I think they just feel isolated right now. They're seeing the weight of what an air campaign over 28 days now can do to the regime, and they don't want that. that kind of focus on them. And the one way to get that kind of focus is to start targeting shifts again in the Gulf of Aden or Bandar Abbas.
So, considering how important the proxies have been to Iran's kind of the extension of its power outside and forming some line of defense, if you will, partially by keeping others busy and just basically keeping them at bay. Uh, the absence of the proxies, the weakening of the proxies, and so on. How do you think that's going to affect what happens next in Iran?
Yeah, one of the conditions for the U.S. ceasefire is that they stop supporting their proxy networks. That they stop funding them, stop arming them. So what happens then? Who's going to fund Hezbollah? Who's going to fund Hamas? Who's going to fund the Houthis? And now the spotlight shifts to Qatar. Qatar's the next main state sponsor of terror that hasn't been designated yet. So when Iran runs out of that ability, the regime runs out of that ability to fund, to arm, to train these proxies. And one mistake the Trump administration can make is if they stop, if they make this conditional, if they say for 5 years don't do this, and that what we've all seen in the past is administrations will provide cover when cheating occurs, when in fact they are starting to arm these militias and proxies again. So right now, these proxies are looking to Iran and seeing that it can't fight back. The only way it can fight back is by punishing its Gulf neighbors that they rely on also in some cases. And they're not seeing Russia and China come to their aid. They're not seeing any allies come to Iran's aid. Uh, so they don't want that focus to be on them. So I think that's one of the reasons you're seeing the proxies basically demonstrate a capability without really trying to earn the wrath of U.S. airstrikes and Israeli airstrikes.
So it'll be 4 weeks in a couple of days since the war started. Considering all just the decapitation of top leadership and just the decimation of so much of its military power and so on, how's the regime surviving?
Well, it's 4 weeks into it. The regime is built to survive this kind of attack, but they didn't. I don't believe they actually, first saw this. I don't think they actually thought this would happen. They believed before Operation Epic Fury started that the playbook was going to work again. The playbook of saying, "Hey, we'll come to the table. We'll talk. We'll delay. We'll buy time, and then we'll try to force, the president into a decision using Erdogan or Qatar or others to influence him." And that didn't happen. So the regime now, if you look at the levels that have been targeted so far, you're almost on a third tier level replacement, meaning it's not the premier leader that had relationships with proxies, that spoke Arabic, that fought in the Iran-Iraq war with them and built that cachet with them, like Qasem Soleimani had, right? When Qasem Soleimani was targeted and replaced by Ismail Khani, the militias, the proxies didn't know who he was because he was focused on Afghanistan. He didn't speak Arabic. He didn't have the relationships. He wasn't on the battlefield during the ISIS campaign. He wasn't on the battlefield when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003. He wasn't a shadow general like Qasem Soleimani was. So there's degradation, right? So now, I'm looking at the tiers of all leaderships from the clerical leadership, guardian of councils, the IRGC, the siege, and seeing that you're going down, 3 or 4 levels to the next guy up, the next man up. Sometimes that man could be a great leader, somebody that they've always wanted to rise in the ranks. And as soon as that person is identified as somebody charismatic, somebody that can lead, somebody that's going to rise to the ranks, they become a high priority target for the Israeli Air Force, for the U.S. intelligence community, to start tracking movement, to start negating that capability. So the regime, again, it's a large country with 1,000 cities. We look at the cities that the regime needs to hold in order to survive. Those are the cities where the airstrikes are taking place the most. This is the first time the Iranian people have actually had the ability to call in an airstrike or a drone strike on a besieged location or an IRGC checkpoint. So this is something we didn't give the Sunni tribes in Iraq until year 4. of our 20-year failure in Iraq. This is already in place for the last 2 weeks. A lot of the intel, even Larijani's strike was was because of civilian inputs, because of Iranian inputs, meaning the people. So the regime right now, I would argue that the only way it survives is if Trump gives it a lifeline. At this point, it's weakened. And one of the questions, if I was in Syria or if I was an enemy of Iran, do I look at it as weakened to the point where I could do something about it, where I could mobilize, where I could continue strikes? We do know that Iran will be left open to airstrikes anytime the U.S. or Israel sees a threat indicator that an air defense asset is being replaced or a nuclear site is being rebuilt or tel launchers are being manufactured or drones are being manufactured. So all of those things are going to remain open. But what does the regime see as an enemy now? Is it the people? Is it a Sunni force out of Iraq? Is it a Sunni force out of Syria? Is it a new movement to go towards a weakened Iran? We have to remember before the ISIS campaign, it was Jelani and Baghdadi that looked over their left shoulder and said, look, Iraq's pretty vulnerable right now. They don't have the ability to defend themselves. We've taken on the sixth largest military in the Middle East, being Syria, and we've defeated it, or we've at least held it on par, right? So why not look over our left shoulder at Iraq? What happens now? Do those militias, do those Sunni groups tied to Jelani and ISIS remnants and other Al Qaeda elements look to engage the Sunni tribes of Iraq, take back Baghdad from the regime control? There's a lot of things going on right now. The regime is so weakened now. I think some of the conversations inside of the White House are, will we create a vacuum to where Sunni groups start taking over key areas in the Middle East because the Shia crescent is no longer strengthened to the point of being able to resist the next ISIS or the next Al Qaeda movement in the Levant or inside of Iraq or Iran.
I want to explore IRGC versus Artish with you, and now with this three-person council of Rezai and Vahidi and Kolibov, and IRGC seems to be quite ascendant, and Artish has probably been kept intentionally weak for some time now. Where do you think the power balance stands now, and how might that play out?
Well, it's definitely with IRGC right now. The IRGC has already publicly come out and said that they reject all U.S. proposals for a ceasefire. So the IRGC is in control, but it's fractured. There are schisms. And inside of the intelligence community, when I was back in the intelligence community, we would look at these schisms as opportunities. Where can we get somebody to reconcile, or who are the unreconcilables? Who do we go after? Who do we engage? So that's kind of what's happening now. And of course, Israel's probably leading that charge. They're just better at it than we are. Identifying those key members inside of the IRGC that are willing to break ranks. But the hardliners that they're hard. I don't like to use the term hardliners because I think everybody, inside of the regime is a hardliner. That's just something that we float out here so that we can engage this regime and keep it afloat, unfortunately. But the regime has its supreme leader, right? Supreme leader that we don't know. We don't have proof of life yet. We don't know if he's alive, if he's injured, but he's the perfect supreme leader for the IRGC because they get to make all the decisions, and they're the ones that can make people disappear. They're the ones that can threaten people. They're the ones that can say no and push back. And we've heard some of the comments inside that have been leaked out about the distrust amongst the politicians, the parliament speaker, the IRGC head at this time. So there are opportunities to exploit this to further weaken the regime, and I think those efforts need to continue.
What type of scenario do you see where there might be a recurrence of the demonstrations, protests, and kind of popular uprising that we saw at the end of December and the beginning of January before so many thousands were
Well,
massacred?
we're about to test that. The Israelis have said, Benjamin Netanyahu has said, stand by, wait. Bradley Cooper, leader of CENTCOM, has said, stand by, wait. You will know when to come out and start protesting. So we're going to test that theory that there is going to be a popular uprising once the green light is given. Uh, it's I often talk about this. If you and I were looking outside of our window and we could see a besieged checkpoint, and then we could call in and see it disappear, would that give us motivation to go outside? Would that give us motivation to start protesting? But then you got to think about the ones you don't see, the snipers, the ones that are waiting for that to happen, that would, that would, you know, shoot protesters. But then we've also seen, I don't know why we don't talk about this, but something that in every war we've done is we've armed an opposition group. We provided weapons, intelligence, logistical support. And I think we've learned from our mistakes about arming the wrong group. In Iraq, we armed the Hashd al-Shabi, which was the wrong group to go against ISIS because they saw every Sunni as a terrorist. In Syria, we armed the YPG, and instead of Sunnis because Iran didn't want us to make another Sons of Iraq movement inside of Syria, and Iran didn't want the Obama administration to make another Sons of Iraq Sunni movement inside of Iraq, and that's something that you know through they talked to Brett McGurk about, and that was something that during the JCPOA talks, that was one of the conditions. We'll go in, we'll provide air cover for, operations against ISIS, but we will not build a Sunni group because we want these nuclear conversations to continue, the JCPOA. So, there are a lot of things that we've learned not to do. And at this point, this is the first time that we've been in a situation where the population has said, when are you going to attack? When are you coming? Where are the airstrikes? So now that that's happened, will we see a group on the ground capable and willing to go after these groups? And I'm not talking about groups that exist right now, the MEK, the Kurds. I'm talking about the people that have had skin in the game inside of Iran that want the regime gone. And those are the people we're waiting for. Those are the people we have to support. And if we don't see them, we can't force our hand. We can't force that regime change. We can't put an American face on it. We can set the conditions, and we have to see if the people see a window. And when we say the window's open, green, go, and they don't go, then you claim victory. Hey, we degraded the regime. We took out its nuclear facilities. We degraded its drone capability. It's coming to the table weakened. It is now dependent on U.S. favor in order to survive. So, those kind of arguments can be made by this administration.
About the U.S. versus Israeli objectives in this, obviously, any two countries that join in an action such as this are going to have, they have their own interests and so on. How do those differences play out now? Talking in this week of March, kind of where do you see a divergence, and how do you see, the willingness, a different willingness on one side versus the other, or one party among the Israelis and the U.S., one party to be willing to find an accommodation or settlement more quickly than the other might?
Well, I think when it comes to U.S. Israeli cooperation, when it comes to Iran, we have 2.5 more years of Trump. What will an election cycle do to a commander in chief? When there's a threat. Right now, you have political capital. You're not really worried about public opinion right now because, in Trump's words, he's doing the right thing. And as a Middle East analyst, as somebody who's studied the IRGC and looked at Iran, the threat from the regime over the last, 47 years, um, you know, it's about time that the world is actually sees this threat from the regime. That strike against Diego Garcia revealed that the regime was lying about his ballistic missile reach capabilities. And now Israel is kind of justified in saying, listen, we told the world about this. We're going to deal with this. And I think one of the things that when I've talked to advisors inside of Netanyahu's circles, I've been to Israel twice since Gaza, and I've met with, officials, when they come to DC, is, Israel has to do what's best for Israel. And if Netanyahu said no to Trump, uh, Republicans would support Netanyahu over Trump. Now, that's where you get the split, right? The MAGA conservative and the traditional Republican. So Tom Cotton, or Lindsey Graham, or even Rubio may not say it publicly, but they would say, "So you got to keep going. You got to keep going. You cannot stop." And you cannot stop Netanyahu from continuing because Iran is an existential threat to Israel. And now it has new partners. I don't, definitely with the UAE and Bahrain, we Qatar's insignificant. Doesn't matter. They just fund this stuff. They don't really have a major play in the game. And I would argue that Qatar's actions during Operation Epic Fury demonstrate that we don't need that base in Qatar. We haven't been able to use it. We had to evacuate it. And if anything, it just became a target. So it doesn't need to be there. When it comes to Israel continuing this mission, I think the UAE would actually support that as well. Bottom line is the regime is weakened right now. And, Trump can hit all of his check marks and say, okay, I've done all this. We've set the conditions for the Iranian people to move. They haven't. So we're going to go to the table and we're going to talk about this. And we have a ceasefire. But Israel will probably be allowed to do targets of opportunities. If you see these things, these threats start emerging again, you are weapons free, meaning you can hit those targets, maintain that capability, and we'll assist in that. And that's where I think if I was worried about something, I'd be worried about that. Trump telling Israel to stop and it not being time yet, kind of like the 12-day war. As soon as he came out and said, I appreciate your attention to this matter, turn around right now. And it was a mistake. 12-day war, it was a bumper sticker campaign. He started promoting it and you just knew we would have to go back. You knew it didn't really solve anything. And I think, Operation Epic Fury learned its lesson from the 12-day war in quotations. And it's continuing. This regime should not be able to threaten to shut down this major commerce choke point in the Strait of Hormuz or use a proxy to shut down Bab el-Mandeb. There's a lot that we can do wrong here, but if it continues so far, I think it's been an exceptional military campaign.
So as we draw to a close, I want to ask you, as somebody who really is an expert in your field and we're in the middle of a war, sometimes you kind of wonder, I wish people would know this or understand this. It might be the media. I wish they reported this differently, or I wish they talked about this aspect more, or policymakers kind of, and clearly you have the ear of a lot of policymakers, but is there something that you want to impart that you think isn't being heard?
Absolutely. People that are against this war have a sincere baseline. They don't want to see another forever war, right? They don't want to see 20 years in Iraq, 20 years in Afghanistan. My argument would be that the reason we had a 20-year war in Iraq is because the regime financed the Shia militias and Al-Qaeda that were targeting Americans. The reason we had 20-year failure is we allowed the regime in Qatar to finance the Taliban, the Haqqani network, and Al-Qaeda. So if you want to end forever wars, you have to end the regime that's been funding them. That's what Iran has done for 47 years, is fund proxies to attack Americans. And in the case of the Iraq war and Afghanistan war, I'm an expert witness in these terrorism cases that take place in both countries. And, there's clear material support and lethal aid from the regime. And I would argue we're 4 weeks into a war that is going to end forever war financing from this regime in Tehran.
Michael Pregent, thank you.
Thanks for having me, Andres. Appreciate it.